There are over 90,000 active missing persons cases in America right now. Most will never be solved. But sometimes, just sometimes, nature refuses to keep a secret. On a crisp October morning, nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains, a German shepherd named Kodiak froze mid-step. Something in the air shifted. The forest, once quiet, exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. And what he found under that tree didn't just crack open an old case. It unraveled everything. Before we follow Kodiak into the woods, make sure to subscribe to Animal Heroes and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. The sun had barely stretched across the peaks of the Cascades when Kodiak began his training hike. It was the kind of morning most people dream about. Golden light spilling through tall evergreens, the forest floor littered with pine needles, cool air humming with the scent of fall. Deputy Joe Miller, mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and a voice as worn as his boots, walked steadily beside his K9 partner. They had done this trail 100 times before. Kodiak, a large German shepherd with a jet-black saddle and caramel-colored legs, padded quietly next to him, his nose twitching every few steps. He wasn't sniffing for fun, he was always working. For Kodiak, the world was scent. Where others saw trees, Kodiak smelled age. Where they heard silence, he detected secrets. "Easy, buddy," Miller said, his voice soft but firm. He reached down and gave Kodiak a pat on the side. "It's just training today." But Kodiak didn't slow. In fact, he stopped entirely. Miller turned. "What is it?" The dog didn't bark, didn't whine, just stood stock still, ears forward, breathing deeper now. His body coiled with a quiet tension. Then, he moved. Suddenly and without hesitation, Kodiak veered off the familiar trail, diving nose first into a dense thicket. Miller cursed under his breath but followed, brushing past branches and ducking under low limbs as the terrain grew rougher. The air was colder here, damper, less traveled. "Kodiak," Miller called. "That's not our path." Kodiak didn't respond. He was locked in, his nose sweeping in tight arcs as he moved down a slope. Miller's boots sank into moss and uneven rock as he struggled to keep pace. Then, Kodiak began to dig. It wasn't the kind of casual pawing he did when curious. This was frantic, determined. His strong front legs scraped at the earth with a rhythmic urgency, tossing dirt, pine needles, and small rocks behind him. Miller dropped to his knees, heart now thudding in his chest. What the hell? A strange pile of flat stones was partially buried at the base of a thick old tree. But they weren't natural, no way. Someone had stacked them with intention. Kodiak's paws had scattered them just enough to reveal what was beneath. A patch of fabric, weathered but distinct. Miller gently pulled it free. It was soft wool, torn and stained. A scarf, maybe? But who would bury a scarf out here? He leaned back, staring at the makeshift cairn, and that's when he knew. This wasn't lost clothing. It was a grave. The forest, once serene and sacred, suddenly felt violated. Birdsong had stopped. The wind through the trees now sounded more like whispers. Miller glanced at Kodiak, who had sat back but still stared at the ground, his chest rising and falling with steady purpose. "Good boy," Miller whispered. His voice was thick. "You did good." But this was only the beginning. Because once the crime tape went up and forensics moved in, what they would find, and who they would connect it to, would tear open a mystery long buried. It would reach all the way to a grieving neighbor, a charming widower, and a woman named Ilara Vance, someone no one had seen in almost 7 years. This was no longer a training hike. It was the start of a case that would test every instinct, every ounce of patience, and every fragment of truth left behind. And it all began because one dog refused to ignore a scent the world had long forgotten. The small town of Crestwood had its secrets, but it was also the kind of place where everyone knew your name, whether you liked it or not. It was late afternoon when Detective Isabella "Izzy" Rossi walked into the county sheriff's office, the steady rhythm of her heels against the worn linoleum floor almost like a drumbeat. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that could read a room in seconds and a calm that disarmed even the most hardened criminals. After 25 years in law enforcement, this was supposed to be the calm before her retirement. But as she walked past the desk piled with files, one particular case caught her eye. The missing woman from Cascade Ridge, Ilara Vance. Her name was haunting in a way that lingered even after she'd gone missing all those years ago. The case had been closed, deemed voluntary disappearance by the department. But something about Ilara's absence never quite settled in Izzy's gut. Maybe it was the mystery surrounding the disappearance, or maybe it was the fact that no one had looked too hard. She couldn't say. But today that case was back on her desk. The dog's discovery had opened up a door that, for years, had remained sealed. She stared at the file, flipping it open to find Ilara's picture, her face framed by soft waves of auburn hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The scent of Ilara was more than just a cold trail. It was now a living, breathing ghost in Izzy's thoughts. She glanced down at the report again and sighed. A ghost. That was the best way to describe Ilara. Gone, but never quite forgotten. Izzy's office smelled like a mix of old paper and fresh coffee, comforting in its mundanity. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Carol, the neighbor who had called in the tip about the scarf found in the woods. Detective Rossi. Carol's voice trembled, thick with emotion. I need to talk to you. It's about Ilara. I think there's something I missed. Izzy had worked these small-town cases long enough to know when someone was trying to hide something. She grabbed her jacket. It was time to listen. Carol's house sat at the edge of Crestwood, a cozy old ranch-style home that had seen better days. The door creaked open when Izzy knocked, revealing a woman in her late 70s, wearing a faded sweater and a pair of glasses that always seemed too large for her face. Detective, please, Carol said, ushering her in. I've been thinking about it all day. I was so sure Ilara left voluntarily, but after all these years I feel like I've failed her. Izzy nodded, encouraging her to continue. Carol was an old friend of Ilara's mother, and though the woman had passed away years ago, Carol was one of the few people who knew Ilara better than anyone. She poured them both a cup of tea, her hands shaking ever so slightly. I know this is hard, Izzy said softly, leaning forward. But if you know anything at all, it's not too late. Carol looked down at her hands, avoiding eye contact. Ilara, she was always so distant after the divorce. She used to love to garden, you know. She had this peace when she was outside in the garden. But when Gavin started getting more controlling, she became different. I don't know if I can explain it. Izzy raised an eyebrow. Gavin Vance? Her ex-husband? Carol nodded slowly. Yes, he wasn't a bad man, but after the divorce he wanted to control her life even if they weren't together anymore. She was scared of him, Detective. She said he always made her feel trapped, like she could never leave. He would tell her how she should live, what she should do. He used to show up at her house uninvited. She hated it, Izzy scribbled in her notebook. This was the first time anyone had openly admitted the truth that Ilara had been afraid of Gavin. Carol hesitated, looking over at the window where the last of the daylight was fading. She confided in me, Detective. About Ben Carter. Izzy's pen froze mid-sentence. Ben Carter? The Wilderness Guide? Yes, Carol said, nodding quickly. Ben was different. He was the only one who made her feel free again. She said when she was with him, she could breathe. She could be herself. Ben Carter. The name felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place, but there were still too many gaps to fill. Izzy hadn't heard of Ben much beyond being the guy who guided tourists through the woods. He wasn't a criminal, but something about him didn't sit right in her gut. Could he have known more than he let on? Did she ever say anything specific about Ben? About what might have happened between them? Izzy asked. Carol shook her head. No. But she would have never gone off with him. Not without saying goodbye. Not after everything. Izzy's mind raced. She was connecting dots, but the image was still blurry. By the time Izzy left Carol's house, the sky had turned dark. She walked to her car, mind buzzing. Something wasn't right. If Gavin was the puppet master behind Ilara's life, could he have been the one to pull the strings in her death too? And what role did Ben play in this twisted tale? Back at the office, Izzy sat down with the file again, turning the pages slowly. Ilara's life didn't add up to a simple disappearance. She hadn't just walked away. There was something else. Something bigger lurking beneath the surface. The mystery deepened with every new lead. The answers weren't here yet. But they would come. Izzy knew it. The early morning fog clung to the trees, making the Cascade Mountains feel like a dream. Quiet, still, and mysterious. Izzy stood on the edge of a narrow, overgrown trail, her boots sinking slightly into the moist earth as she scanned the forest. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine and rich soil, and for a moment she allowed herself to take in the peace. But the tranquility didn't last long. This wasn't a walk in the woods. It was a search for answers, and the answers were out there. She could feel it in her gut. The previous day's conversation with Carol had rattled her. Ilara's relationship with Gavin hadn't been as peaceful as the official reports made it seem. There had been fear, not just animosity. Gavin's need for control over Ilara was more than just a petty power struggle. It was a dark obsession, one that might have pushed him to extremes. But there was another piece to this puzzle. Ben Carter. Carol's words had lingered in Izzy's mind. Ben was the one who made Ilara feel like she could breathe, she had said. There was something about Ben that didn't sit right with Izzy. The connection between him and Ilara needed to be explored further. But for now, she had a different lead to follow. Back at the sheriff's office, Izzy sat at her desk, her pen tapping rhythmically against the paperwork in front of her. The light in her office was dim, a single lamp casting shadows over the stack of files. The clock ticked steadily in the background, the only other sound in the room. She pushed the file of Ilara's missing person report aside and pulled out Gavin Vance's financial records. The man had always been successful in the world of architecture, well-known, well-respected. But there was something in the numbers that didn't add up. Izzy had been through enough cases to recognize the telltale signs of a man under pressure. Gavin's company was drowning in debt, and recent business transactions showed he'd been moving money around in suspicious ways. It was clear Gavin had been desperate, and desperation often led to bad decisions. As she flipped through the bank statements, one thing caught her eye: a large withdrawal, just a week before Ilara disappeared. The amount was significant, too significant to be a coincidence. Izzy sat back in her chair. Could this be the moment? The financial pressure could explain Gavin's actions, but the question was, what did he have to hide? Why was he so afraid of losing Ilara's life insurance policy? The answer wasn't clear yet, but it was something Izzy had to follow. And there was another lead: Ilara's recent bank activity. She had been in the process of closing out her joint accounts with Gavin and was planning to move the money into a private account in her name alone. A person trying to break free, but just before she could take that final step, she vanished. Izzy's phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. She answered immediately. "Detective Rossi?" The voice on the other end was hesitant. "This is Ben Carter." Ben's voice was rough, like he had been up all night, and Izzy immediately picked up on the subtle tension in his tone. He wasn't calling to clear his name. "I heard you're asking about Ilara," Ben continued, the words tight. I'm not sure what you're looking for, but there's something I need to tell you." Izzy leaned forward. "What is it, Ben?" He hesitated again, as if weighing his words.
"I know you've heard about me, and I know I'm not the one you're looking at right now."
"But I think I know what happened to her." Izzy's heart skipped a beat. This was the break she had been waiting for. Ben Carter was offering her something. "I'm listening," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the urgency in her tone betrayed her. The conversation with Ben wasn't easy. He was defensive at first, reluctant to get into specifics, but Izzy's patience eventually paid off. Ben had an alibi. He'd been guiding a group of hikers that weekend, but there was something in his words, something he kept circling back to that made Izzy wonder. "I saw Ilara 2 days before she went missing," Ben finally admitted. "She came to the cabin. She wanted to talk about things with Gavin. She said she was leaving him. She was scared, Detective. But she was determined. She told me she was done." Izzy's mind raced. What happened after that? Ben was silent for a moment. "I don't know. I wish I had known more. She didn't show up the next day like she said she would. I thought maybe she had just changed her mind, but I should have known better. I should have seen it. She was scared, Detective. Gavin, he had a way of making her think she couldn't escape. She wanted to, but... Ben, did you see anything that day? Anything unusual?" "No," he answered quietly. "But I think Gavin knows more than he's letting on. You need to look at him closer, Detective. You need to look at the money." Izzy ended the call with Ben, her thoughts spinning. The money, Gavin's desperate financial moves, Ilara's escape plans, it all connected in a way that was beginning to make sense. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Izzy drove out to Cascade Ridge the next morning, hoping to find something more concrete. The fog was still thick in the air as she walked along the trail where Kodiak had discovered Ilara's grave. This time she wasn't just following the scent of the forest. She was following the scent of a lie, and Gavin was the source. The town of Crestwood was as quiet as usual, but Detective Izzy Rossi couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break wide open. The investigation had been a slow burn, each lead a thread weaving its way through a tangled web. But now, with Ben Carter's confession hanging in the air, Izzy had more questions than answers. Ben wasn't the answer. He was a piece, but he wasn't the one who had pulled the strings. No, the true puppet master behind Ilara's disappearance had to be Gavin Vance. The ex-husband who hadn't just lost a wife, he'd lost control. The problem was, the more Izzy dug into Gavin's life, the more polished and perfect it seemed. He was a respected architect with a successful business, always in the spotlight, always charming. But beneath that veneer, she sensed cracks. And those cracks? They led back to money. It was early evening when Izzy drove out to Ben's cabin deep in the Cascade Wilderness. The fog from earlier in the day had settled and the air felt heavy, like it was holding on to something dark, something unresolved. She was ready for answers. Ben had agreed to meet her. He seemed nervous on the phone, but there was also something else. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Izzy didn't know which one it was, but she was about to find out. She parked in front of the cabin, the gravel crunching beneath her tires as she stepped out of the car. Ben was standing on the porch, his broad shoulders hunched, his face as weathered as the woods around him. He didn't smile, but his eyes held an urgency. He motioned for her to come inside. The cabin smelled like wood and dampness, the scent of the wilderness seeping through every crack. There was a quiet desperation in the air. Ben poured them both a cup of coffee, his hands shaking just enough for Izzy to notice. "I told you everything I know," he said, sitting down across from her at the small wooden table. "But there's more you're not seeing," Izzy raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He looked at her with wide, worried eyes. "I've been thinking about it all night. I've got a lot of regrets. But I should have told you this earlier. Gavin Vance wasn't just after Ilara. He had a plan. And I was just a pawn in that plan." Izzy leaned forward, her instincts kicking in. Gavin Vance wasn't a man to let anyone get in his way, especially not someone like Ben. The more she thought about it, the more everything started to fall into place. Gavin had been playing the game for years, pulling strings behind the scenes. But what was his true goal? Power, control, money? "Ben," Izzy said, her voice low. "What are you saying? How do you fit into this?" Ben's hands tightened around the cup. He was shaking now, his voice barely above a whisper. Ilara was a part of something bigger. Gavin wasn't just controlling her. He had her tied to something even more dangerous, something that could ruin him if it came out. Izzy stared at him, trying to piece together what he was hinting at. "What do you mean by dangerous?" Ben looked around nervously as if the walls might have ears. "You need to look at Gavin's finances. There's a reason he was so desperate. Ilara found something that would have exposed him. It wasn't just her life insurance. It was a bigger deal. She was going to blow the lid off something Gavin had been hiding for years." Izzy sat back, digesting his words. This was the piece she needed. Ilara had uncovered something Gavin had worked hard to keep buried. Money, influence, power, whatever it was, Gavin had been hiding it in plain sight, and Ilara's disappearance was more than just a domestic tragedy. It was a calculated move to protect something far more valuable. Ben's eyes grew wide and he lowered his voice. "Ilara didn't tell me everything, but she said Gavin had been involved with some shady dealings. I don't know the full extent, but I know enough to understand what she was up against. She didn't want to go public with it. But she had no choice. And when she started getting close to the truth, Gavin acted first." Izzy felt her heart race. "You're saying Gavin killed her to cover up a financial scheme?" Ben nodded grimly. "He didn't just kill her. He erased her. He made sure there was no trace of her. The police never found anything. But I've been telling you, Detective. Ilara wasn't just some woman running away from a bad marriage. She was a threat. And Gavin was scared of her." Izzy's mind raced. Ilara had found something. Gavin's financial empire, built on lies, deceit, and maybe worse, was crumbling, and Ilara had been the one to see it. This wasn't just a domestic crime anymore. This was a cover-up of something much darker, something that stretched far beyond one missing woman. The financial records, the sudden withdrawals, the hidden debts, all of it led back to Gavin. But it wasn't enough. Izzy knew she needed hard evidence, something concrete that would tie Gavin directly to Alara's death. And there was one place left to look. As she stood up to leave, Ben called out, his voice almost a plea. "Detective, please just know that I loved her. I always did. She was the only one who made me feel like I could belong somewhere. I never wanted any of this to happen." Izzy gave him a long look. Ben wasn't the killer, but his role in this twisted web wasn't over yet. She had to find out more. Back at the sheriff's office, Izzy started pulling the last pieces together. She reviewed the evidence, the connections, the patterns that had emerged in the last few days. And as she stared at the pile of financial records in front of her, it hit her. The last piece of the puzzle was in Gavin's hands. But how could she prove it? How could she get Gavin to confess? Izzy knew one thing for sure. Gavin had underestimated her. And now it was time for the investigation to turn the tables. The rain had started up again by the time Izzy pulled into the sheriff's parking lot. It wasn't the heavy kind of storm, but the kind that drizzled, steady and cold, seeping into everything, just like the case she was working on. Every lead, every scrap of information seemed to soak into the ground, impossible to grab hold of. Izzy slammed the car door shut and wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders. The damp air bit at her skin as she walked up the steps to the office. She was no closer to solving Alara's case than she had been a week ago. Gavin's financial troubles, Ben's confession, and the growing mystery around Alara's disappearance all pointed to one thing. Gavin Vance had something to hide, and he was doing everything he could to make sure it stayed hidden. Inside, the office buzzed with the low murmur of police officers talking shop, phones ringing and printers whirring. But it was quieter than usual. Something felt off. Izzy dropped her bag on her desk and began sorting through the paperwork again. The financial records were a mess. Hidden accounts, fake names, transfers to offshore entities. It all led back to Gavin. But there was still nothing concrete, nothing that would force him into a confession. Then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Deputy Miller. "Kodiak's found something new. Meet us at the ridge." Izzy's heart skipped a beat. The K9 unit had been involved from the beginning, but they hadn't found anything significant since Kodiak discovered the grave. If Kodiak had picked up a new scent, it could be the break they needed. The ridge wasn't far from town, but it was an eerie drive, the rain pelting against the windshield, blurring the road ahead. The Cascade Mountains were beautiful, but tonight, they seemed suffocating. Kodiak was out there somewhere, working through the storm like he always did, calm, relentless, driven. When Izzy pulled up, she saw Miller standing by the truck, a faint smile on his face, but his eyes were tired. Kodiak sat at his feet, his black and tan coat shining even in the dim light. "Got something, Detective?" Izzy asked, stepping out of the car, pulling her hood tighter. Miller nodded. "Kodiak's been all over this area again. He hasn't given up on this spot. Keeps sniffing around the same place. We thought it was a fluke at first, but now..." Izzy's instincts told her to follow Kodiak. She trusted this dog more than most people. She knew he had something. She just needed to figure out what. Kodiak led them down a small, overgrown path, his nose twitching in the rain-soaked air. He moved with purpose, darting between trees, until he stopped at the base of a large rock outcrop. The ground here was slick with rainwater, but Kodiak wouldn't budge. Izzy crouched down beside him, looking at the ground where Kodiak was focused. There, half covered by a blanket of moss, she saw what he was after, a small metallic object. It was partially buried, just like the first clue they had found, but this time it was different. "Dig it up," Izzy instructed Miller. Together, they uncovered the object. A keychain. A small, tarnished metal piece with an intricate engraving. It was the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking closely. On the back of the keychain was a logo, one Izzy recognized from the financial records, Gavin's architecture firm. She held it up, the weight of its significance settling in her chest. This wasn't just a random piece of junk, it was a connection. It was the kind of evidence that tied Gavin directly to the scene, and it was the first solid piece of proof she had that Gavin was involved in whatever happened to Alara. Back at the office, Izzy sat at her desk again, the keychain resting in front of her, her mind working overtime. This keychain was the smoking gun. But she couldn't just confront Gavin with it. She needed more. She needed something that would tie everything together, something that would force him to crack wide open. She sifted through the evidence again, pulling up the records on Gavin's firm and the questionable transactions. Then her eyes caught something. A transaction from Gavin's firm to a company that wasn't listed anywhere in the files. The company was listed as a contractor for a new building project that didn't exist on any public maps. Izzy's breath caught in her throat. She knew where that building project was. It was in Cascade Ridge, just a few miles from where Kodiak had found the keychain. The project had been shut down months ago due to code violations, but Gavin had moved money around to keep it alive. Why? Izzy picked up the phone and dialed. It was time to pay Gavin Vance a visit. The next morning, the air was heavy with the remnants of last night's rain, and Izzy arrived at Gavin's sleek office in the downtown district. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, but there was a tightness in her eyes that suggested she knew something was wrong. Izzy didn't waste time. "I need to speak with Mr. Vance," Izzy said firmly. The receptionist hesitated but then motioned to the back office. Gavin's office was everything she expected. Cold, polished, and designed to impress. He was standing by the window staring out at the city when Izzy stepped in. "Detective Rossi," Gavin said smoothly, without turning. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Izzy didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed the keychain on his desk, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition. "That's not mine," Gavin said quickly, but his voice cracked. "It's yours, Gavin." Izzy's voice was calm, unshaken. "It was found at the site of a building project you tried to hide, a project that doesn't even exist on public records anymore." Gavin turned slowly, his face hardening, the facade of charm slipping away. "You don't know what you're messing with, detective. Stay out of my business." Izzy didn't flinch. She'd heard this kind of deflection before, but it didn't change the fact that the walls were closing in. She had him cornered, and the truth was just a few steps away. Kodiak had given her the final piece of the puzzle, and now it was time for Gavin Vance to face the consequences of his actions. The city skyline glittered in the distance, but Izzy Rossi wasn't thinking about the bright lights. Her mind was stuck on the keychain. The way Gavin had reacted, the secret building project she had uncovered, and most of all the unsettling feeling that everything was connected. She sat in her office at the sheriff's department, sifting through the papers in front of her. Gavin Vance was running out of places to hide, and while the keychain had been a breakthrough, it was still just a piece of a much larger puzzle. There was no denying it anymore. Gavin wasn't just a grieving ex-husband. He was a man who had carefully built a life of lies, manipulating people, hiding his financial woes, and pulling strings behind the scenes to maintain his grip on everything. But why? What was so important that he would go to such extreme lengths to keep it buried? Alara Vance's disappearance was no longer just a missing person case. It was a web of deceit, a tangled mess of money, power, and secrets that spanned far beyond one woman's life. The more Izzy dug, the deeper it went. She knew it was time to confront Gavin. But there was still one missing piece of the puzzle, the mystery of that building project. Why had Gavin been funneling money into a non-existent property? What was he trying to hide? Izzy's phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Miller. His message was short, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. "We need to talk. Meet me at the office." The sheriff's office was still buzzing when Izzy arrived. Miller was already at his desk, his brow furrowed, clearly deep in thought. "What's going on?" Izzy asked, closing the door behind her. Miller didn't speak immediately. He just handed her a folder. "I ran a background check on that building project Gavin's been hiding. And, well, we found something." Izzy sat down and opened the folder. Inside were blueprints, plans for a new building. Except they weren't just any plans. These plans were for a massive underground facility, not a shopping mall, not a hotel, a facility designed to store something. But what? Izzy's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a development project, this was something covert, something that Gavin had hidden away for a reason. "What is this?" she whispered, more to herself than to Miller. Miller looked up, his face grim. "I don't know, but it's not good. The blueprints match some property records that were sealed by the county. I can't access any more details, but it's clear Gavin was up to something big. He wanted this buried, and I think Ilara knew about it." Izzy's thoughts raced. Ilara had uncovered something she shouldn't have, something so dangerous that Gavin had to silence her. But what was this facility? And what could be so valuable that Gavin would go to such lengths to protect it? They needed to find out, but time was running out. Gavin had already shown that he was willing to do whatever it took to keep his secret safe. "I'm going to need to get into that building project," Izzy said, determination in her voice. "We're going to need evidence from the site." Miller nodded. "I'll contact the local authorities and get a team together. We can't afford to wait." Later that afternoon, Izzy and Miller stood outside the fenced-off property. The building site was eerily quiet, surrounded by trees and overgrown brush. It felt like the kind of place where people went to disappear. The place had been abandoned for months, but Izzy could still see remnants of the work that had once been done. Half-finished walls, rusty construction equipment, and piles of debris scattered about the site. Kodiak was already out of the car, his tail wagging, sniffing the ground. He had been with them every step of the way, and Izzy trusted him like no one else. His instincts had always been spot on. "Let's see what we've got," Izzy said, pulling on her gloves and heading toward the entrance. The keychain had been a sign, but this was where they'd find the truth. Kodiak led the way, his nose sharp and focused, weaving through the debris like he knew exactly where to go. Izzy followed, her heart pounding with each step. It wasn't long before Kodiak stopped, his body still, eyes locked on a large, rusted container tucked behind some metal scaffolding. It wasn't part of the original blueprint, and it definitely wasn't supposed to be there. "Dig, boy," Izzy ordered. Kodiak immediately started digging around the base of the container, his paws frantically pushing dirt aside. Miller knelt beside him, digging with his hands, and together they unearthed the object that Kodiak had found. It was a metal briefcase, old but surprisingly intact, covered in mud and dirt. Izzy's breath caught in her throat. They pulled it open together, the sound of the latch snapping echoing through the silent property. Inside they found documents, files upon files, neatly stacked. But as Izzy flipped through them, she saw something that made her stomach turn. Legal contracts, off-the-books transactions and property deeds, and then she saw it, the name, Vance Holdings, LLC. This was no ordinary building project. It was a front, a cover for something illegal, something that could destroy Gavin if it got out. Izzy stood up, the briefcase still open in her hands. This was it. This was what Ilara had uncovered. Gavin's empire was built on lies, and now the truth was in her hands. "Get this to the lab," Izzy said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "We've got him." Back at the office, Izzy looked over the documents again, her mind racing. The pieces were finally starting to fit together. Gavin Vance had been running a massive illegal operation, hiding behind the guise of his legitimate business. And Ilara? She had been the one to find out. But the most important question was still unanswered. What was Gavin planning to do with all this? And how far would he go to keep it from being exposed? The tension in the sheriff's office was palpable. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the discovery in the abandoned building still hung heavy in the air. Gavin Vance's empire had just started to unravel, piece by piece, and Izzy could feel the gravity of it. She stood in front of her desk, the documents from the building project scattered around her. Vance Holdings, LLC, the name echoed in her head like a warning. These weren't just business papers. They were the key to everything. Gavin had been running a massive illegal operation, hiding behind the facade of legitimate architecture. And Ilara had found the cracks in the wall, cracks Gavin had desperately tried to seal, but she hadn't been able to. Izzy's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The number on the screen wasn't unfamiliar. It was Miller. She answered immediately. "Detective?" Miller's voice came through the line, tight with urgency. "We've got a breakthrough. We've traced some of the funds from the Vance Holdings accounts. They lead to a private bank account, one that's been linked to some dangerous people." Izzy's heart raced. She'd been expecting something like this, but Hearing it confirmed made it real. The deeper Gavin had gone, the darker it had become. These people weren't just businessmen. They were players in a much bigger game. And they were playing for keeps. Where are the funds going? Izzy asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that surged through her. From the looks of it, Miller continued, they're being funneled into offshore accounts. And there's a connection to organized crime. The kind of people you don't just cross. Izzy slammed her fist down on the desk, frustration mounting. This wasn't just a simple case of corporate greed anymore. Gavin had dug himself into a hole so deep that the only way out was to keep people like Alara quiet, and anyone who got in his way. We need to move fast, Izzy said, her voice sharp. Get the team together. It's time to bring him in. Miller's voice lowered, tinged with hesitation. I don't think we can handle this ourselves, Izzy. These aren't people we want to mess with. Izzy took a deep breath, her mind calculating the next steps. She couldn't afford to back down now, not after everything she'd uncovered. She needed to take the fight to Gavin before his connections could silence her. No more waiting, Izzy said, determination in her voice. We're going in. By the time the team assembled, the stakes had never been higher. The sheriff's office was alive with the low hum of activity, officers gathering their gear, preparing for the raid. Kodiak, always by Izzy's side, was alert, ready for anything. He knew there was more to the story, and so did Izzy. They arrived at Gavin Vance's estate just after dusk. The large modern house looked pristine, but there was an underlying sense of tension that made the air feel thick. The gates were locked, the security system sophisticated, but none of it would be enough to stop them. Izzy motioned for the team to move forward. She could feel the weight of the evening bearing down on her. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about stopping a dangerous man from escaping justice. A man who had been hiding behind his wealth, his power, and his charm for far too long. Inside the house, the lights were dimmed. The grandiose living room, with its sleek furniture and glass windows, felt empty, even though Izzy knew Gavin was inside somewhere. He had nowhere left to run. This was the end. Miller was at the front of the team, ready to breach the door, but Izzy stopped him with a quiet motion. She knew Gavin's type. He'd try to talk his way out of this. He'd try to manipulate his way to freedom, as he had done countless times before. I'll handle this, Izzy said, her voice low but firm. The team exchanged glances, but they knew better than to argue. Izzy was the one who had been in this fight from the start. They trusted her. Izzy walked toward the door, the click of her boots echoing in the silence of the house. She knocked hard and fast, and within moments she heard movement on the other side. Gavin opened the door, his usual polished smile gone, replaced by a look of frustration and fear. Detective Rossi, he said, his voice steady, but there was a crack in it. I didn't expect this. You never do, Izzy replied, stepping inside with Kodiak by her side. We need to talk. Gavin's eyes darted to the side as if weighing his options. He opened his mouth to say something, but Izzy didn't give him the chance. You don't get to make the rules anymore, Gavin, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. You're done. Gavin stepped back, his face momentarily showing signs of panic, but he quickly regained his composure, crossing his arms defensively. You think this is going to end well for you, Rossi? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Izzy's eyes didn't leave his. I think you're underestimating how much of this I already know. The money laundering, the fake projects, the people you've been working with. It's all connected, Gavin. His face twisted in disbelief, but for the first time Izzy saw something break. Something that told her he realized it was over. He took a step back, his voice a whisper now. What do you want from me? Izzy's voice was steady, but her eyes were cold. Everything. As the rest of the team entered and secured the house, Gavin's empire began to crumble. The documents, the offshore accounts, the organized crime ties, everything was laid out before him, and there was no way out. Later that night, as the investigation continued and the team worked to gather the final pieces of evidence, Izzy stood by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Kodiak sat by her side, his eyes steady as if he understood everything that had just happened. It had been a long, difficult road, but in the end justice had prevailed. Gavin Vance had been caught, and as much as the case had changed her, Izzy knew one thing for sure. Some secrets were too dangerous to stay hidden forever. The air in the sheriff's office was still thick with the remnants of the storm that had passed. The fluorescent lights hummed above, and Izzy Rossi sat at her desk, staring at the piles of evidence before her. Gavin Vance had been arrested. His empire had crumbled, and yet it all still felt so surreal. It had been weeks since that first discovery in the Cascade Ridge forest. Weeks since the keychain had led them here. This moment of truth. Ilara Vance's case had gone from a missing persons investigation to a major federal case, exposing a web of corruption, fraud, and organized crime that stretched all the way to the highest levels of power. Gavin's operation had been more than just financial. It had been criminal, deadly, and ruthless. But Ilara had been the key. She had unearthed what Gavin had tried so desperately to bury, and in the end it was her courage, her desire to break free that had led to Gavin's downfall. Izzy looked down at the photograph on her desk, Ilara's face, smiling in her garden, looking so full of life. It was a reminder of what had been lost, but it was also a symbol of justice. Ilara's soul had been silenced, but the truth had spoken loud and clear, and in doing so it had given her back her voice. It was late in the afternoon when Miller walked in, his steps quiet but sure. He had been with Izzy through every step of this case, every turn, every breakthrough. She looked up as he approached, handing her a small folder. "We got the final report," Miller said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "The federal charges are official. Gavin's assets are frozen, and the connections to the crime syndicates are being traced." Izzy nodded, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Good, it's finally over." Miller leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "You think it's really over?" Izzy paused, glancing at Kodiak, who was lying by her feet, his eyes closed but ears alert. Kodiak had been with her from the beginning, a silent partner, a protector. "Maybe for Gavin it's over," Izzy said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "But for everyone else it's just the beginning. There are people who were pulling the strings, people who think they're untouchable." She was right, of course. This case was just the tip of the iceberg. Gavin might be behind bars, but his network was still out there. The shadow of his actions would stretch far beyond the walls of his fancy office and private estates. Izzy leaned back in her chair, looking at the file once more. She could still hear the echoes of that first discovery, the way the ground had shifted beneath her feet when Kodiak had found the keychain. It felt like a lifetime ago. The landscape of Crestwood had changed since then, somehow both darker and more hopeful. The world was different now. And so was Izzy. She glanced at Miller, then turned to Kodiak, who had gotten up and was standing near the door, wagging his tail. "You ready to head home, buddy?" Izzy asked, her voice soft. Kodiak barked a single sharp sound as if in agreement. Miller chuckled, his expression softening. "It's crazy, isn't it? How much a dog can do," Izzy smiled. "He's more than just a dog. He's family." As Izzy packed up her things and turned off the lights in her office, she couldn't help but think about everything that had led to this point. The twists, the turns, the near misses. There was a price to justice. Ilara had paid it with her life, and Gavin was about to pay it with his freedom. But there were still people out there, still shadows lurking, still strings being pulled, but for now, the world felt right. Izzy walked outside into the cool evening air, Kodiak at her side and Miller following behind. The sky was streaked with pinks and purples as the sun set over the mountains. The air was crisp, the kind that made you feel alive. Izzy paused for a moment, looking up at the horizon. The case was closed. The truth had been uncovered. But as much as she wanted to feel the weight of the victory, something inside her told her the fight wasn't over. There would always be more to uncover, more to fight for. But tonight she could rest. As they walked toward their cars, Miller looked over at Izzy. "You did good." "We did good." Izzy nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "We did." And as she drove home that night, the weight of the case finally lifting from her shoulders, she knew there was one thing for certain. No matter how dark the world got, the truth always finds its way to the surface. Thank you for following along on this journey. It's been a long road, but justice has been served. What do you think? Do you believe Gavin's arrest is the end of the story? Or are there still secrets left to uncover? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more gripping stories like this one.